Okay, we're here with Peter Molnar, and Peter's the chair of the Lake County Winegrape Commission, and he's also the general manager and partner here at the Obsidian Ridge Vineyard in Red Hills. And Peter's going to tell us a little bit about the elevation of wine in Lake County. Peter.
Yeah, well, absolutely. It's good to have you. So, a couple things. Obviously, we're here at a mountaintop. It's a bit of a blustery mid-November day. We've come through a pretty crazy harvest, which ended on a high note for us here in Lake County. I'll get to that a little bit later. But I wanted to talk a little bit today about the northern Mayacamas and the mountains of the North Coast in general. We are part of the four-county North Coast appellation, so that would be Napa, Sonoma, Mendocino, and we're up Lake, which is the northeast quadrant of those four counties. And we call ourselves the mountains of the North Coast because that's where we are. Right behind us here are the Mayacamas. High Mayacamas run from St. Helena up north to the intersection of Lake and Mendocino counties, and behind me are the Vaca Mountains. So the two mountain ranges that define the North Coast kind of meet and then elevate in Lake County. So everything in the county is above 1,350 feet, which is the elevation of the lake right behind us, and with the exception of some areas in Middletown. But predominantly the vineyards are between 1,500 to 3,000 feet. So that's the highest average of any region in the North Coast, and we have some of the higher vineyards in the state here. Now, what does that mean for wine quality and grapes and how we farm? Very basically, mountain viticulture is very different than valley viticulture. Almost, I think some 3% of the vineyards in California are over 1,000 feet up, so above elevation. So we're talking about a fairly small part of the total wine industry in California. And we're talking about learning a whole new way of farming. Most of the research has gone into farming and viticulture and so forth have been done at sea level maritime regions. I think of Bordeaux, and I think of Napa Valley and UC Davis, and the research has been done there. Much of it applies up here, by the way. This is not totally off the grid rocket science we're doing up here, but we're definitely adapting to how a plant reacts to being in a mountain environment, in a higher elevation environment. And I remember after being up here, after farming for 30 years in Carneros, we planted here at Obsidian Ridge, which is at 2,640 feet here. We're at half a mile in elevation, one of the highest vineyards in the North Coast. I realized about 5 years into this, we had our Toto, we're not in Kansas moment. You know, we're farming, but the grapes are developing differently, the plants are developing differently, and we've got to adjust to that. Let me get into some of the specifics of that. One is, mountains are colder, typically in the spring, and they get colder again in the fall. So you have a later start in the spring, and sometimes a quicker finish in the fall. I'll give you an example. This year was such a crazy year. We had 2 inches of snow up here on June 1st. June 1st, typically, sea level vineyards are already about this much, or maybe even this much canopy, and we were still completely in bud. And yet, in late October and early November, we were picking here at 25 bricks, perfectly ripe fruit. And how does that happen? The thing that drives plants, of course, is photosynthesis. Now, there has to be a certain amount of heat in the ground to get plants to come up. And mountain soils heat up later. They're colder. They tend to warm up later in the springtime, which is the signal for the plant to get growing. But then after that, it's all about sunlight. And what we find is that at about 1,000 feet, each 1,000 feet you go up in elevation, you have about 3% more ultraviolet light. And that is really the horsepower that drives plant development and then maturation of the fruit as well. So here we're basically standing, we have 6% more ultraviolet light than you would say, or maybe almost 10% because we're closer to 3,000 feet, than you would at sea level. That doesn't seem like a dramatic amount, but it's a cumulative effect over the course of the season. So what does that mean? That means that we're starting to get more UV into the berry earlier on the season. That means breaking down of pyrazines. Pyrazine is that not very attractive flavor of green bell pepper that we don't like to see in red wines. Turns out ultraviolet light early in the season, before veraison, helps break that down. We have a stimulus of the thickness of the skin. Basically, over the course of the season, like every biological creature and plant, it wants to propagate and preserve its seed. So what the grape does is it reacts by making a thicker skin. That thicker skin is where all the good stuffing that we like in red wine and all wines comes from. So all the phenolics, all the anthocyanins, a lot of the flavor compounds. Then the third component happens is that ultraviolet light also matures the seed as it goes. So now we have breaking down of pyrazines, we have development of color and good phenolic concentration, and then the final stage is we have maturation. One of the things we're studying is the maturation of tannins. Now tannins are very important with red wine. They're a type of acid chain, and they help basically give structure and length to wine. And they are these very complex molecules that also fix and grab color components that make wine richer and make it last longer. So well-aged wines typically are wines that have longer tannins. For example, the very classic one is Bordeaux from Cabernet. Bordeaux is the longest aging of all wines. It has high tannins. Tannins can be tricky though, because you don't want tannins that are unripe. You don't want tannins that are unresolved. They can be really kind of drying of your mouth. They can be very unpleasant. So if you have tannins, especially Cabernet, which we grow here, the grape already naturally has a lot of tannins. This kind of rocky soil, also a product of being in the mountains, helps develop even more tannins. We've got to mature those tannins. Now the question is, okay, short season, don't have a lot of maturation time. How do you get around to maturing those tannins? What we're finding, and not just ourselves, but in collaboration with other organizations in Argentina and also in the Alps, or those regions that are at the borders of the Alps. I'm thinking of northern Italy or Switzerland, parts of France, is seeing how increased ultraviolet light, because of our elevation, is developing and maturing tannins and other components within the grape. And the research on this is still developing, to be honest, but what we found is that most likely the increased ultraviolet light throughout the whole berry, through the whole season, again, this accumulated extra 10%, probably starts that maturation process earlier and then is more intense over a shorter period of time. So we can hopefully achieve the same maturation of these compounds that otherwise would take a longer time in a sea level site. But what are the advantages? The advantages up here, outside of those three factors coming together, are good acidity. Now, what happens as you try to find and mature a grape right into that zone? You want to have sweetness, obviously, that creates the alcohol. You want to have phenolic maturity. You want to have color. But then you want to have acidity. Now, you can have high phenolic, high alcohol wines with no acidity, and it really wouldn't be very pleasant. Acidity is really that component of wine that gives it structure and length, and it keeps it somewhat refreshing. It's a simple analogy is if you have salmon and you put some lemon on it, the whole flavor profile pops. That's really what we try to do when we look all around the world. We're looking for areas that can have longer maturity, either because of more ultraviolet light, or rather not long maturity, full maturity because of ultraviolet light, or because of a longer season, or if you look north in British Columbia or Washington, because they have very long days during the middle of summer. But in all of those cases, we have one factor that's keeping acidity towards the end of the season. Heat breaks down acidity. If you are near the ocean, if you are near the North Pole, because you're further up north, there you have a short season and it gets cold in the fall because there's less sunlight hours. Or if you're up in the mountains, each of those climatic variables will allow you to maintain acidity throughout the season. And if you look down here at the very bottom of our vineyard, you see it's all completely orange now. By the end of the year here, we actually start having frost at the very bottom of the vineyard. So we're having very cool nights, and that's a big component about having the maturity but maintaining the acidity all throughout the process. And ideally we pick the grapes around 24, 25, 26 bricks, a nice acidity to maintain throughout fermentation and aging and when you're drinking it, and then finally good color and concentration. So those are some of the advantages that we find up in the mountains. The other, probably less provable, but one thing that we find is if you look around here, we've got a lot of this wild vegetation, which we call chaparral in California. We have manzanita, we have live oak, we have pine trees up here. All of those components are absorbed by the skin of the seed and are translated into wine. So I love mountain fruit because it has a kind of a wild, spicy character to it that I think is indicative of the place that it was from.
Peter, a couple questions, and we'll as we get further into this, we'll dig in future segments further into this topic. But from a vineyard management standpoint, I think two things that are, one, very relevant this year with humidity and moisture, and then another one being pest pressure. Can you speak briefly to those 2 points in high elevation?
Sure. So we're higher, drier, shorter, and colder, right? We're higher in elevation. Our air is drier up here, like most typical mountain settings. For example, humidity here is typically half of what it is in Napa during the summertime. It'll be 40% humidity there, it's 20 here. It's colder in the wintertime, so it kills overwintering bugs, and it's a shorter season, so there's less time for having these large vegetative growth periods where you have pest pressure. So let me go backwards on let me go back through a few of these things. Higher and drier. Drier means we have less mildew pressure. We have to treat for mildew pressure here with sulfur, as every vineyard in the world does, about half as much as we do with our Napa vineyards. It's pretty significant. It's a pretty significant amount of sulfur we use. It's a pretty significant amount of in cost as well. It's also in a season like this year where we had, unfortunately, a lot of the North Coast suffered with rains. We had a lot of botrytis issues, which is botrytis is fruit rot or gray rot. It can be fruit rot, it's called, and it basically makes the grape unusable. The skin dissolves, and it's just scary. You don't want to even think about it, but it happens. It happens in all wine regions. Lake County this year rode through that very nicely. It did rain a lot up here. These very well drained soils soaked it up right away. This dry air and wind came in and cleared out and dried out the grapes. There was very little mildew pressure in Lake County. So first you have, rot pressure. First you have less mildew pressure. Second, you have less rot pressure when it does rain. Colder means that overwintering bugs are we drop below freezing quite often. The last day of harvest, actually the next day it was 27 degrees here. That kills a lot of bugs that overwinter and can carry a number of vineyard pests and diseases with them. So we have very low pest pressure here. I'm thinking of a light-bound apple moth. I'm thinking of sharpshooters, things like that. They're pretty much non-existent in Lake County. And shorter. So shorter means we have kind of a quick start in the season. So the canopy comes up. We don't get a ton of canopy up here. Large canopies tend to be a host for mildew pressure and pests. Our canopies are relatively small and moderate up here, which is good for wine quality, by the way. But in terms of vineyard management and pest pressures and so forth, what all that adds up to is that we have, as it happens, Lake County has the lowest application rate of any wine region in California for how many pesticides and herbicides we use in the vineyard.
Excellent, Peter. Thank you. Well, as I mentioned, we'll be delving into these topics in greater detail in future segments, so we'll see you soon.
Okay,
Thank you.
Sounds good. Thanks for coming up.
Yep.